The incredibly true adventures of two girls in love. Though each of the girls had their own way of staying close to Emma in the off-season, for Billy, it was easier. The area around the vineyard held a special sway. She spent summers during her undergraduate years there and then graduate school at the Marine Biological Lab at Woods Hole. When she was offered a full-time job at Woods Hole, she jumped at the opportunity. Since the summers she spent with Emma on Oak Bluffs were the highlight of her year, she figured that living in Woods Hole would be like having summer all year round. Billy loved her work at the lab. She was the point person for a multinational team conducting research on sustainability solutions. Emma had offered to let her live year-round in the house, but Oak Bluffs was a full hour away from Woods Hole in the fall and winter, and the ferry ran infrequently. She found a little cottage to rent, an old ferry station that had been renovated into a work-live space by an intrepid photographer. The cottage had floor-to-ceiling windows in the front, a full en-suite on the main floor, and a loft bedroom with a giant skylight on the second floor where she could watch the stars at night. It was just a short walk to the Nobska Point Light, a lighthouse where you could take in the panorama from Vineyard Sound to Chappaquiddick and beyond. She moved into the cottage in September and spent weekends at Emma's through October. After that, Emma closed the house for the season, and the vineyard population dwindled from the summertime high of 100,000 to the winter average of 15,000. Very few of the year-round residents were African American, outside of the scientists who worked at the lab. The majority of Billy's neighbors were white, working-class people who were conservative at best, and she feared racist at worst. Early during her first November, when it became clear that Billy was going to be a year-long resident, her elderly neighbor, Leslie Cushing, knocked on the door. She introduced herself as Mrs. Albert Cushing and asked if she could come in. Mrs. Cushing was a petite woman in her late 60s who was dressed head to toe in LL Bean. Her jeans were sturdy and shapeless, and she wore a red plaid shirt over a garnet red turtleneck, and an insulated parka ensured that she would never feel the cold. Billy invited her in, and the older woman sat on the couch, looking uncomfortable. "We've never had an African American in the neighborhood before," Mrs. Cushing said. She said the words as if it were a foreign term that she'd looked up on Duolingo. It reminded Billy of the way so many Americans took a simple phrase like "Comment allez-vous" and butchered it to "Comment allez-vous." It wasn't that the way they said it was wrong, it was just that the way they said it wasn't right. Mrs. Cushing continued, "I want you to know my husband has no experience with African Americans at all, but Albert's a good man. All I ask is if he uses the wrong words, like colored, you take a beat before calling the newspapers. He's a good man, and we aim to be good neighbors to you." Mrs. Cushing declined the cup of tea that Billy offered her, but pressed a torn piece of paper into her hand. "This is our landline," she said, "and both of our cell phone numbers. If you get into any kind of trouble, you call us. Around here, We look out for our own. Albert Cushion never did more than nod in Billy's direction. But whenever there was a snowstorm, she woke up to find that he'd shoveled her front steps and cleared the driveway. Her car was never blocked in. The week before Christmas, she came home to find a tin of sugared pecans in her mailbox. "Merry Christmas from the Cushings," said the pre-printed label on the tin, and the note inside read, "These are homemade. My mother's recipe. Season's greetings, Leslie." Provincetown was a full 2 hours away, but the parties were always worth the drive. When Akari, one of her friends from the UN, invited her to a New Year's Eve party in P-Town, Billy decided to book an Airbnb and make a weekend of it. She decided to dress sexy but casual in a cashmere cardigan and cashmere bralette, which peeked out from underneath, her favorite pair of flared jeans and black-heeled booties. She was standing with Akari and her friends when a beautiful young Puerto Rican woman named Dolce came over to their circle. Akari introduced her. "Billy, this is Dolce. She's actually a vineyard girl like you." Billy was intrigued. She was sure if she'd seen Dolce on the island, she would have remembered her full lips and the long chestnut brown hair that fell all over Dolce's curves. Dolce said, "I'm a sous chef at Rockfish in Edgartown." "I know the place," Billy said. "It's one of my godmother's faves." "What do you do?" "I work at the Marine Biological Lab in Woods Hole." "So you're a scientist?" Billy nodded. "My work focuses on climate change and sustainability solutions." Dolce made a face. "But wasn't the whole concept of climate change created by the Chinese to make the U.S. manufacturing sector less competitive?" Billy almost spit out her drink. "Seriously," Dolce said, "my dad works at the Toyota plant in San Antonio, and he told me all about it. Besides, it's December 31st, and it's 18 degrees outside. How can global warming be real when it's so cold?" Billy didn't know what to say. She'd never fallen in and out of love with someone so quickly. She hated it when the beautiful ones were so dumb. She was looking at Dolce and trying to formulate a response when Dolce and Akari both burst out laughing. "Dude," Dolce said, "I'm messing with you. Of course I know climate change is real. Akari had already told me what you do, and I think it's really cool. People like you are going to save the planet." Over the next few weeks, Billy and Dolce were inseparable. Dolce was gorgeous and funny, but mostly Billy was drawn to her creative energy and her propensity to see the positive in everything. Dolce listened without rolling her eyes to podcasts by happiness experts like Gretchen Rubin and Dr. Tal Ben Shahar. She lit candles to Catholic saints and to African deities with equal fervor. Her favorite sleeping t-shirt was one that read, "Magic is fucking real." Billy hadn't realized how being a climate change scientist could take you to some dark places until she saw how much light Dolce brought into her life. Billy had once dated a girl named Courtney, who was a massage therapist. The girl refused to give her a massage, ever. "I hate to bring my work home. I'm sure you understand," Courtney said. Eventually, Billy broke up with her, not just because she had been banking on some free massages, The way Courtney touched her, cold, disinterested, almost clinically, was so unappealing. Billy thought either Courtney was deeply asexual or she was actually the worst massage therapist ever. In contrast, Dolce was a caretaker, always cooking, even when Billy said, "You must be exhausted. Let's go out. My treat." Dolce preferred to be in the kitchen. "I became a chef because I love it," Dolce would say. "Plus, there's nothing in this town as good as what I can whip up in 30 minutes or less." She was, of course, right. In the morning, before work, they didn't just dash to the car with toast and coffee, which had been Billy's go-to forever and ever. On weekday mornings, Dolce made sriracha eggs with crispy kale, cauliflower and rainbow shard frittatas, apple cacao, and coconut muffins. Most evenings, Dolce worked late, but in the winter, she only worked on the weekends. And during the week, she'd spend all afternoon in the kitchen trying out recipes she was considering adding to the restaurant menu. Honey turmeric pork with watermelon radishes and rainbow-colored beets, slow-cooked pineapple pork ribs served with corn, lobster, chile, and cotija cheese. One weekend in March, Dolce brought home a cotton candy machine. It was the dead of winter, but Billy's little house felt like a carnival because all around the kitchen there were tiny cones of cotton candy in all different colors and flavors. She kept asking Dolce, "What are you making?" But Dolce, who was dressed in a light blue jumpsuit that was zipped just low enough that Billy could see the curve of her breast, winked and said, "You'll see." For dinner that night, Dolce served them a large bowl of steamed mussels with a giant dollop of cotton candy on top. Billy was confused. "It's pretty, and you're a genius, but I really don't get it." Dolce smiled and said, "I'll be right back." She returned with a small ceramic gravy bowl of steaming soy and garlic broth. She poured the broth over the cotton candy and it melted into the mussels. It's ginger cotton candy, which, if I've got it right, should add a perfect mix of spicy sweetness to the broth, Dolce said, looking at the bowl with trepidation. She was right. It did pair perfectly, and the dish she'd experimented with at home became the most popular item on the restaurant's menu. Billy began to see how much cooking was science, how Dolce experimented with textures and flavors the way she used experiments to test sustainable solutions in oceanography in her work. It felt good to be with someone she was never bored with, who made her feel so satisfied intellectually, emotionally, and physically. In her field, Billy had learned that the best, most reliable results were comprised from broad-scale observations and detailed field experiments. That winter, it seemed to her she got to experience, both with Dolce, the pleasure of observing her girlfriend, the way she carefully made the daily shopping list for the restaurant, the way she checked in on her team over text and phone calls, urging people to stay home and take care of their sick kids or spend a day with their dying dogs. "It's not high season," Billy could hear Dolce say over the phone. "When service slows down, it's time for us to take care of ourselves and the ones we love." Dolce balanced the demands of a hectic job with the same grace that she balanced flavors in the kitchen. She didn't complain. She didn't go fishing for praise. She just got the job done. As they sat in the living room in their little fairy house, watching the boats go by on cold winter evenings, drinking wine, and eating delicious food, Billy felt like her grown-up life was beginning. This was love. This was her vision of marriage. This was what she wanted the rest of her life to be like. Time seemed to slow down in the evenings when Dolce filled the space with candlelight and music. Dolce made the best playlist. She played artists that Billy had never heard before, but loved at first beat. Singer-songwriters like Ozuna, the Highwaywomen, and Wavy, the Creator. They didn't own a TV, but on Saturday nights, they propped an iPad on their laps and watched a movie or a TV show. On the Saturday after Christmas, Dolce suggested they skip going out for dinner, and instead, she cooked up a skillet of spaghetti carbonara and they ate it with 2 forks right from the pan in bed. They drank a beautiful Shiraz and binge-watched the entire first season of The Crown. Billy had always thought that the saying, "food is love," was a cliche, but life with Dolce made her think differently. Dolce was food. Dolce was love. And with Dolce, food was the adventure of a lifetime. Mrs. Cushing took note that Dolce had gone from being a weekend visitor to moving in. "I see you've taken a roommate," Leslie said. "Makes sense. I cannot believe what Bernard Holmes was charging for rent for that place. It's a wonder what regular people can even afford to live out here anymore." Billy wondered if they'd think of her as regular people if they knew that she and Dolce were a couple. She thought of how Mrs. Cushing had said that out there in Woods Hole, they took care of their own. That had expanded to include her as a woman of color, but was it elastic enough to include a gay couple? The more they talked about it, the more Billy and Dolce felt strongly that it didn't serve them to come out to the year-long residence of Woods Hole and Edgartown. They both worked late hours, Billy at the lab, Dolce at the restaurant. They both got their fair share of catcalls and harassment by local white boys who both longed to date them and cursed them for being uppity. "It would be different if we were just here for the summer," Dolce said when they lay in the bed at night, listening to Obey by candlelight. "But it doesn't feel comfortable for these kind of people to know all of our business." "I couldn't agree more," Billy said, wrapping her arms around Dolce. Billy was determined to tell Alma and her god-sisters the minute they went back to the Bluffs this summer that she had met the love of her life. It would be the first time in years they would all be on the vineyard together for a stretch, instead of long weekends here and there. She had decided it was enough playing cloak and dagger with her godmother. She and Dolce were the real deal. She wanted everyone to know it.